Being Charlie accidentally became one of Hollywood's saddest movies. Everyone thinks Being Charlie is bad because of its unsympathetic protagonist, formulaic writing, and failure to say anything new. They're right. But what they're missing is that Being Charlie is worthwhile precisely because of its faults. When viewed today, it plays less like a rehab drama and more like an unusually intimate family portrait.
If they say you only have a year to live, do it sober. It'll seem like an eternity.
Firstly, reviewers point to the film's unsympathetic protagonist as a main criticism. They complain that the titular Charlie is cruel, spoiled, and impossible to root for. Important to note, however, critics do generally give credit to the character's boldly autobiographical nature, as he's based on screenwriter Nick Reiner's own personal struggles with addiction. To respond to this criticism, I agree with the reviewer's assessment. There's no way around it. Charlie is unlikable. However, Charlie's unsympathetic characterization is exactly what makes Being Charlie interesting, as he feels profoundly authentic to Nick Reiner's personality. Immediately, I want to push back on the subtext of this criticism, namely that, in order to be successful, a movie's characters need to be likable. This simply is not true, and Being Charlie is a stellar example of this. For his autobiographical stand-in, while writing the screenplay, Nick Reiner could have easily sanitized his more unsavory personality traits. And if he had, then the movie probably would have been more of a commercial success. However, his refusal to rewrite history is what makes Being Charlie ring so true. This is because while watching it, the viewer intuits that Charlie is an authentic reflection of Nick Reiner himself. Furthermore, considering Nick Reiner's recent introduction into the headlines, a time capsule of his psychology is considerably more valuable than a likable fluff piece ever would have been. To further explain my point, take the talent show scene as an example, in which Charlie performs an impromptu comedy routine. Throughout the movie, this is the only time that it seriously attempts to portray Charlie as cool. For this scene, the intent is to place the viewer in the perspective of the crowd. This is evident in the camera placement, with a low-angle wide shot inviting the viewer to look up at Charlie on stage, intercut with various eye-level compositions of his support group audience. Thus, just as the diegetic audience laughs at these jokes, we, the actual audience, are invited and expected to join in on the laughter. With that in mind, director Rob Reiner does everything he can to set Charlie's comedic chops up for a slam dunk. However, Nick's writing for this potential denouement falls conspicuously flat, as the jokes are simply strange. Thus, Charlie, and by extension Nick, comes off as seriously disturbed and maladjusted. Throughout his routine, he exploits the opportunity to vent his frustrations, primarily regarding his fixation with his father, culminating in a particularly demented joke about his grandmother having an igloo for a pussy. All things considered, at the time of Being Charlie's release, the critics were totally justified in writing this scene off as unfunny and cringeworthy. Watching this today, however, Charlie's routine reads as a remarkably revealing insight into Nick Reiner's state of mind. He's disinterested or unable to accept his father's generous invitation to flex his comedic chops. Instead, Nick cobbles together a cry for help, which tragically flies completely under the radar. Altogether, however, that's the key to understanding Being Charlie as a work of art. It's fueled by the competing forces of Rob Reiner's well-meaning yet misguided direction and Nick Reiner's troubled yet deeply authentic ramblings.
Oh, what, you taking their side?
Right, you're right. Go shoot up, prove everyone right.
Secondly, reviewers cite the film's formulaic writing as a main criticism. More specifically, they complain about the movie's over-reliance on cliches, plot contrivances, and genre tropes as a substitute for quality screenwriting. To respond to that, I agree with the reviewer's criticisms here. However, the formulaic writing is exactly what makes it fascinating, as it provides further psychological insight into Nick Reiner. To elaborate on this, take the common addiction movie cliché of the dysfunctional family unit, which Nick Reiner apes for his screenplay. How Nick employs this cliché is notable, however, as he pushes it into the realm of extremity. As the most glaring example of this, Nick Reiner writes Charlie's dad as exceedingly uncaring and oblivious, heavily implying that he's the one who's responsible for Charlie's problems. On that note, returning to the creative conflict between Nick and Rob, it's remarkably odd how Rob Reiner's direction refuses to filter out Nick's vitriol. Clearly, Rob knows that Charlie's father is based on him, yet Rob does virtually nothing to push back on Nick's perspective, or to soften the character. More than likely, Nick and Rob Reiner's creative conflict on being Charlie is reflective of their personal relationship. In the movie, the father and son relationship operates in a continual negative feedback loop, in which the father validates yet fails to properly sublimate his son's growing hatred. That said, due to his troubled state of mind, it's unlikely that Nick consciously understands the negative feedback loop he's depicted here. Thus, to return to the main point, herein lies why Nick's formulaic writing is a necessary crutch. He's unable to confront his issues directly, so he funnels his frustrated psyche through phony gimmicks and cliches. Due to Nick's warped perspective, however, the avenues in which these cliches manifest are inevitably bizarre. To further elaborate on this, the ending confrontation between Charlie and his father demands further analysis. Of course, for addiction-centric movies, ending on a parent-child reconciliation like this is a classic, almost required cliche. Given current events, however, this scene appears more eerily prescient than cliched. To explain why that is, in this scene there are two lines of dialogue which need to be singled out. Firstly, Charlie's father, explaining his perspective, laments that, quote, "I'd rather have you alive and hating me than dead on the streets." Apparently, Rob Reiner himself fought to add this line into the movie. This is the only time, by all accounts, that Rob fought to have his own voice heard in the film. Retroactively, this line ceases feeling cliched and gains an incredibly tragic edge to it instead. Regarding this line and how Rob fought to include it, it's clear that he loved Nick, which makes their family's unthinkable outcome all the more devastating. Secondly, Charlie reveals that he abuses substances as, quote, a way to kill the noise, yet that they actually make this noise even louder for him. Ultimately, considering Nick's reported schizophrenia diagnosis, which wasn't public at the time, this line reads as a vulnerable, desperate attempt at reaching out for help. What makes this line even more disturbing, however, is Charlie's father's reaction to it. It goes totally over his head. He completely fails to grasp the gravity of this revelation. Failing to recognize that warning sign, Charlie's father doesn't perk up until he hears his son say that he doesn't hate him. Upon hearing that, his father is satisfied. They hug and amicably part ways. To add my own interpretation, this interaction reads as Nick Reiner, as subtly as possible, condemning his father. He asserts that Charlie's father, who's only interested in being loved by his son, couldn't care less about actually understanding him. Taken all together, this scene is an example of how, on the surface, being Charlie feels hackneyed and cliched. Yet, by searching deeper into it, the movie reveals itself as a bottomless well of insight into the Reiner family.
One of us had to keep him safe.
For him or for you?
Thirdly, reviewers single out how the movie says nothing new as a main criticism. They argue that if a viewer has seen any movie that tackles addiction or rehab before, then they've already seen everything that Being Charlie has to offer. To respond to that, I agree with the reviewers' criticisms here. Upon release, Being Charlie appeared like nothing more than a rote, mediocre drama, with the Hollywood royalty attached being the only notable aspect. With that recognized, due to the untimely fate of the Reiner family, Being Charlie has retroactively become uniquely disturbing in a way that no other movie compares to. Watching Being Charlie today, the Reiner family's tragic fate is impossible to ignore, completely overshadowing the fictional drama. Currently, Nick Reiner is being held in custody, charged with allegedly murdering his parents, Rob and Michelle Reiner. Unfortunately, that's what makes Being Charlie such a singularly bizarre cultural artifact. To my knowledge, beyond a brief special thanks credit in Flipped, it's the only time Rob and Nick meaningfully collaborated on an artistic project. Moreover, beyond interviews and brief PR appearances, it provides the clearest insight into the Reiner family ever allowed for public display. Therefore, although the movie itself isn't necessarily saying anything new, very few films have been changed by history quite like Being Charlie. To be totally clear, I'm not making value judgments here. It would be mistaken, in other words, to interpret this video as me arguing that the real-life tragedy retroactively makes Being Charlie a better film. My argument, to put it succinctly, is that watching Being Charlie today is an inherently different experience than watching it when it was released. The intended experience, upon release, was that of a personal family drama. The new experience, watching it today, is more akin to a true crime psychoanalytical analysis. All in all, this experiential transformation, as a result of its historical significance, is what makes Being Charlie distinctly notable in cinema history.
I think you do this for the courtside seats to human suffering.
Being Charlie didn't change, but history did. And that's why the movie feels like a completely different work today. If there's any other misunderstood or controversial movies like Being Charlie that you'd like me to talk about, then please let me know. One last thing, before I sign off, I want to extend my sincerest condolences to the Reiner family. I hope that the entire situation swiftly reaches an appropriate resolution and that those affected can one day find peace.